Mom never said I'm tired. But when I held her hands for the first time in 30 years, I felt every mile she walked alone. Welcome to Kitchen Table Talks. Here, we tell stories that were never told at the dinner table, stories that stayed inside us because we thought nobody would carry her because the words were too heavy to say. If this story touches you, please like, subscribe, and leave a comment, not for the channel, but for the person who shares their heart. Sometimes the sentence "I understand" can save someone who has been silent for decades. My name is Michael Harrington, Namwabone, living in Bend, Oregon. And this is a letter to my mother. Dear Mom, I don't know how to begin. Maybe I should start with "I'm sorry." It's the one thing I never said when I was young enough to think apologies were unnecessary, when I believed life would simply sort itself out. When I was a boy in Portland, Maine, your hands were everywhere, not on my shoulders, not in gentle hugs. You weren't the type of mother who wrapped her children in arms and kisses. Your hands lived in work, pushing open the diner door before sunrise, gripping heavy grocery bags, passing coffee cups to strangers, feeding coins into the laundromat machines at the end of the street. I always knew when you were tired, but I learned early how to look away. I remember a winter evening when I was 8. It was cold enough that frost clung to the back step like a second layer of paint. You were at the stove, making chicken and dumplings. Steam fogged your glasses, turning them into white circles. You never wiped them. You stirred the pot slowly, as if the whole world rested on the rhythm of your spoon. You didn't say "I'm exhausted." You simply said, "Michael, eat before it gets cold." That was your language. Feeding was love. Silence was survival. There is something people never understand about women like you. You did not want praise. You wanted to be seen. And we, your children who grew up warm because of your sacrifices, never looked. 3 sounds shaped my childhood. The diner door opening at Bon Mui Lama. The clink of coins dropping into a washing machine. Your footsteps across worn wooden floors long after midnight when you thought I was asleep. Each sound was a way of saying, "I'm still fighting for you," but I was too young, too selfish, too protected to understand. Dad left before I turned 1. He took the brown Chevy Impala with him. You told me he was working somewhere far away. I believed you. I believed it for 14 years. One night, when the snow swallowed the streets, you sat at the old kitchen table Grandma left behind. Your palms were open on the surface, as if asking the sky for permission to rest. "Tomorrow I'm not working the night shift," you said. "Why not?" I asked. "Because you have a math test." You never missed a shift, but for a test you did. I was furious. "Don't worry about it. I'm not a kid anymore." You answered calmly, "Tonight, you still are." I didn't eat dinner. I slammed the door. I thought rebellion was independence. Years later, I thought leaving Portland for Boston was the kind of freedom people wrote poetry about. A train ticket, 2 suitcases, a heart full of ambition, and nothing of you. I didn't understand. Not then. I understood at Haimui Chin standing in the law office copy room, holding stacks of paperwork when I noticed my own hands. Dry, cracked, calloused. They looked like yours. Only then did I realize you had lived your entire life, so those marks would never appear on me. I remember the time you came to Boston to visit. I was busy. Meetings, deadlines, clients, problems. Everything was more important than you. You asked, "Does it snow here?" I answered, clipped, impatient. "A little." You looked toward the window. "In Maine, the snow reaches your knees," you said. I replied, "I don't care." You said nothing. No anger, no lecture, no guilt, just silence. It took me decades to understand that silence is how mothers scream. It was the only language left when the world had taken everything else. You never wanted to bother anyone. Maybe that is why you never said, "Son, I'm tired." You spent a lifetime being visible only at the surface. A waitress, a renter in a Tamcham apartment, a woman without a car who walked to work because there was no one to drive her. Nobody knew you read Steinbeck at night. Nobody knew you hummed while hanging laundry. Nobody knew you kept Dad's photograph not to remember him, but to forgive him. Mom, I wish I had seen your hands sooner. Not when they were trembling, fragile, thin as paper. I wish that the night you placed dinner beside my bedside when I was 10, I had said something simple, something human, something that might have saved us both. You must be tired. But I didn't. And that silence will follow me longer than your sacrifices ever did. Dear Mom, the years pass the way leaves falls low enough that you don't notice, sudden enough that one day the branches are bare. I turned 30, then 35. I built a life in Boston, a respectable one-in apartment with tall windows, a nameplate outside an office door, a salary that paid for things I never appreciated. I learned how to be admired. I never learned how to be grateful. I sent postcards on holidays, short ones. Hope you're well. Work is busy. Love, Mike. They were sentences without emotion, like documents signed out of obligation. And you answered every time. Your handwriting was small and careful. You always began the same way. Dear Michael, I hope you're eating well. You never asked me to visit. You never asked me to call. You never complained that I was gone. Maybe you believed that asking for anything would make you weak. Maybe you believed that mothers were supposed to stand still until someone remembered them. I did not remember you. Not truly. I remembered convenience holidays, birthdays, a day in June when I needed your recipe for chicken and dumplings because a woman I dated said she liked comfort food. I called you that Sunday afternoon. You picked up on the first ring. Hi, Mom, I said. Already rushing, already distracted. You sounded surprised, as if you were holding your breath. Michael, are you all right? Yes, I need your recipe. You laughed quiet, honest, forgiving. You didn't ask why. I never called. You didn't ask why. I only reached out when I wanted something. You simply said, of course. Do you have a pen? I wrote everything down. You reminded me about the flour, the broth, the patience. You said the dumplings would fall apart if I rushed them, that good food needed time. Your voice was steady, gentle, familiar in a way I had tried to forget. Before hanging up, you said one last thing. Tell her I hope she likes it. I never told her. She left after 2 months. We ended politely, the way people end things, in cities quietly and with no aftermath. I threw out the recipe. I don't know why. Maybe because it reminded me of everything I had lost without realizing it. Years later, I was bon mauvais when I learned the truth not from you, but from the landlord of the building where you had lived. He called me because he found my number in an envelope taped to your refrigerator door. Your mother hasn't paid rent, he said. She's been missing shifts at the diner. I thought you should know. I laughed, a sharp, defensive laugh. You? Miss a shift? Impossible. I told the man he had the wrong person. Then I hung up. I ignored the signs. I ignored the silence. Silence. Mom, your language had been screaming at me for years. I didn't go to Maine until the diner owner called. Not your landlord this time, someone who knew your hands better than I did. Someone who saw them carry plates for 30 years without rest. He said you'd collapsed behind the counter. He said the ambulance was already gone. He said the words cardiac arrest like they were weather conditions. I drove 8 hours through rain that blurred the road into a long, wet ribbon. I don't remember the music. I don't remember the gas stations. I only remember gripping the steering wheel so hard my bones hurt. When I reached the hospital, you were asleep or something close to it. Your hair was thinner than I expected. Your face was soft in a way I had never seen. You looked small. On the bedside table sat your purse, the same brown one you'd carried for years. It was cracked along the edges, the leather tired, the metal zipper bent. Inside were 3 things: a folded photograph of me on my graduation day, a small rosary missing 1 bead, and a receipt for your last rent payment. The amount was paid in cash. All of it. You had given everything you had again to make sure someone else would not be troubled by your absence. The nurse told me your heart had been weak for years. She used words like neglect and strain, as if they were medical conditions, not the result of a lifetime of caring other people. I sat beside you. Your hands were visible above the sheets. They were smaller than I remembered. The skin was thin, pale, almost translucent. The veins ran across them like rivers on an old map. Those hands had opened doors before sunrise, had served strangers their breakfast with no complaint, had fed me when I was too ungrateful to notice, had held back tears so I wouldn't know you were human. I touched them. Only then did I know what 30 years felt like. Not the years themselves, Mom. but the weight of them. You stirred, barely. Your lips parted as if searching for a sentence. I waited. I thought you would say, "I'm tired." You didn't. You said, "You came." It was not accusation, not relief, not forgiveness. It was love. Small, quiet, enough to break me. I stayed the night beside your bed. I counted your breaths the way children count stars. Through their bedroom windows, slow, fragile, far apart. At dawn, when the hallway lights were still dim, I felt your fingers tighten slightly around mine, not to hold on, not to pull me closer, but as if you were tucking me in one last time. Then you went somewhere I could not follow, not because you left me, but because I had left you first. Dear Mom, the funeral was small. I remember the way people looked at men out with blame, not with comfort, but with a kind of politeness reserved for strangers. The weather was the color of wet concrete. The sky hung low over Portland as if it didn't want to intrude on grief. The air smelled of salt, pine, and the sea, like every memory of childhood I had conveniently abandoned. I expected to see nobody. Then they arrived. Not family, there was none left. Not friends, I hadn't kept any there. It was the people you served at the diner. Men in thick boots who smelled of gasoline. Women in scrubs whose faces carried fatigue I never learned to respect. Truck drivers with road maps in their eyes. A retired fisherman who walked with a limp. The mailwoman who delivered to our old apartment. And a boy maybe 17 wearing a diner apron, holding a crumpled white hat. I don't know why he came. I don't know how he knew you so well, but he stood there like someone who had lost a lighthouse. He stared at your casket and whispered something. I couldn't hear it. Maybe it wasn't meant for me. There was no priest, no ceremony, just the cemetery staff, a plain coffin, and a few chairs set out like an apology. Someone asked if I wanted to say something. My mouth opened. Nothing came out. I had arguments prepared, explanations, philosophies, lines of rehearsed sorrow. I had practiced them in the car, in the mirror of the hospital bathroom, even silently in the elevator on the way down. But in that moment, every speech sounded obscene. How does a person apologize to a lifetime? How do you beg forgiveness from someone who never asked you for anything? I said nothing. The diner owner stepped forward instead. He spoke in a worn, cracked voice, the kind that comes from working 70-hour weeks and never drinking enough water. She never wasted food, he said. She'd take the leftover bread at closing, cut it into cubes, freeze it so she could make stuffing later. There was a soft ripple of laughter. Not because it was funny, because it was true. He wasn't eulogizing. He was remembering. She never sat down during a shift. If I caught her leaning on the counter, she'd pretend she was wiping something. The mailwoman nodded. So stubborn, she said. The fisherman raised his trembling hand. She'd refill my coffee before I asked. Said I reminded her of someone. His voice broke. I don't know if he meant Dad, or me, or just a tired stranger she once pitied. One by one, they offered fragments. She helped me get my first job. She lent me money for groceries. She let me do my homework in booth 3. She gave me her umbrella when it rained. They spoke as if she belonged to all of them. And I realized she did. They didn't know the novels she read. They didn't know how she hummed while folding laundry. They didn't know about the photograph of Dad she kept in the drawer. But they knew her hands. They knew what they carried. I, her son, knew none of it. After the service, they left in ones and twos. No one hugged me. No one asked about Boston. No one said, I'm sorry for your loss. They didn't need to. Loss was not news. It was weather expected, endured, understood. The boy with the apron stayed last. He had pale freckles, hair the color of straw, and eyes that looked older than mine. She taught me how to make eggs without burning the pan, he said. I nodded, unsure what to reply. He hesitated, then added, she said you were smart. I swallowed the words. I nearly said she was wrong. Instead, I asked the only question that escaped me. How long did you know her? 2 years, he said. Longer than some parents stay. He placed the crumpled diner hat on the fresh dirt like an offering and walked away. I stayed. Everyone else disappeared into the wind. The cemetery was quiet, not the kind of quiet that comforts, but the kind that reminds you no one is coming to rescue you. I stood there with my expensive coat, my polished shoes, my hands soft again from office work. I was a successful man with a failed childhood. I tried to speak to the earth, to the sunlight, to whatever part of the universe might still hold you. I tried to say, I'm sorry, but the words stuck like broken glass. Because apologies are not payment, regret is not repair, grief is not debt relief, I left the cemetery with nothing, not forgiveness, not closure, not peace. Only a question that dug into me like claws. What do you do with love when the person who held it is gone? I stayed in Portland for a few days. The motel room smelled of bleach and old cigarettes. I opened drawers and cabinets like a thief, hoping grief might leave me a clue. On the second night, I went to the diner. The neon sign flickered the way it always had. The same parking lot, the same bell above the door, the same smell of grease, coffee, and survival. Booth 3 was still there. I sat in it. A waitress asked what I wanted. I couldn't speak. She waited, pen poised above her pad. Finally, I whispered, "Chicken and dumplings." She glanced at me strangely. "Nobody orders that here," she said. "It's not on the menu." "I know," I replied. "My mother made it." The waitress paused, then leaned in. "Then I'll see what I can do." She left. I stared out the window. Snow was starting to fall. Not Maine snow, just a shy dusting, but it was enough to remind me of everything I had buried. I placed both hands on the table. For the first time in my life, I studied them. The lines, the softness, the mistakes. They were mine again, but I no longer wanted them. I wanted yours. "Dear Mom," the waitress returned 20 minutes later with a bowl that looked nothing like yours. No dumpling shaped by tired fingers, no steam curling into the air as if carrying prayers. The broth was thin, the chicken too pale, but I still thanked her. I ate slowly, spoon scraping the bowl, trying to remember the taste of home. There was no memory waiting there, just emptiness. When I finished, she refilled my coffee and asked, "Do you want anything else?" I almost said, "I want my mother back." But grief makes cowards of us. I only shook my head. She gave me the bill folded in half. No total, just 3 words. "She loved you." I stared at them until the ink blurred. Loved, past tense, a weight heavier than the coffin. I left a 50 on the table and walked out before she could return. I didn't feel generous. I felt exposed. Outside, the snow thickened. Not a storm, just enough to remind me of childhood mornings when you woke before light, cleaned the windshield while I sat inside the car complaining about the cold. You never saw it as hardship, only routine. At the motel, I lay in bed fully clothed, staring at the ceiling. Sleep is strange when grief is freshet comes in short, violent waves like drowning. Each time I closed my eyes, I saw your hands. Not your face, not your voice, only your hands. The next morning I drove to your apartment. The landlord had given me the keys, reluctantly, as if passing on responsibility for something fragile. The hallway smelled of dust and cheap paint. Your door was the 4th on the left. I remember that much. I hesitated before turning the knob, as if opening the door would reveal every mistake I had tried to bury. The apartment was nearly empty. A sofa with springs poking through the fabric, 2 mismatched chairs, a chipped coffee table, no television. The walls were bare except for a single thumbtack above the kitchen counter. Whatever had hung their calendar, reminder, prayer was gone. There was no clutter, no souvenirs, no signs of indulgence or vanity, just survival. The refrigerator held 3 things: a carton of milk, half empty, a container of leftover mashed potatoes, and an envelope taped to the door. My name was written on it. I didn't open it immediately. My hands trembled in a way that felt borrowed, as if they were not mine, but yours, tired, cracked, afraid of breaking. I sat on the sofa and listened to the silence. Not the silence of peace, the silence of absence. Only then did I open the envelope. Inside, a letter, your handwriting, small and careful like always. "Dear Michael, do not feel sad. I lived a long life. Longer because you were in it. You do not owe me anything. You never did. Be kind to yourself. You work too hard. I know that kind of pain. Love, Mom." There were no metaphors. No dramatic confessions, no accusations, just that last line. You did not sign your full name. You did not sign mother. You signed mom, as if you never stopped believing I was still your child. I reread the letter until I knew every loop of every letter, until I could trace the shape of your words with my eyes closed. I folded it carefully and put it in my pocket. It felt like a heartbeat. I cleaned the apartment. I don't know why. Maybe I was trying to fix something, to undo years of being absent. I washed the dishes. There were only two. I wiped the counters. I swept the floor. I found your old winter boots beside the door, soles worn almost smooth. I lifted them to my nose eyes, like a child, and I smelled snow and cheap coffee and morning frost. That smell broke me. I sat on the floor and cried until I could not breathe. Not the quiet tears of regret, not the polite grief of funerals, but the choking, violent sobs of someone who understands loss too late. I cried for the woman who worked when she was sick, for the woman who kept her pain secret so her son could dream, for the woman who buried her loneliness behind coffee cups and diner plates, for the woman whose entire life was a prayer she never voiced. I cried for you, and I cried for me, because I finally saw you, and seeing you was unbearable. I stayed one more night in the apartment. I slept on the sofa with your boots beside me like sentries. I dreamed of childhood, not the real one, but the one I invented to avoid guilt. In the dream, you and I sat at the kitchen table. You poured me cocoa. I thanked you. You smiled. That was all. When I woke, sunlight cut through the blinds like thin blades. The apartment was colder, the world unchanged. But something inside me had shifted. Before leaving, I opened the kitchen drawer. I don't know what I was looking for. Maybe nothing. Maybe everything. Under a stack of grocery receipts, I found a recipe card. Your handwriting again. Chicken, dumplings, moat cup flour, high eggs, salt if you want, but not too much. Don't rush it. They fall apart if you rush them. At the bottom, a small note. Save this for someone who needs it. Not for me, not for yourself, for someone else. Even in death, your love was outward, not inward. I folded the card and placed it in my wallet. I did not throw it away this time. I locked the apartment door. I slid the key beneath it like sealing a letter I would never send. I stood there a long time in the hallway, not wanting to walk away, because stepping back felt like betrayal. No one passed by. No one asked if I was all right. No one comforted the adult child who finally realized his mother had been a hero. Heroes never ask to be recognized. They only hope quietly that someone will remember. I stepped outside. The snow had stopped. The air was sharp enough to sting. I took a breath, deep, and whispered into the wind, I remember. Dear Mom, I did not return to Boston immediately. Something in me refused to go back to the world that had treated you like a ghost. I drove aimlessly north, then west, then south as if grief were a compass and I was trying to find north again. I stopped in small towns with one gas station and diners that looked exactly like the one you worked in. Sometimes I went inside. Sometimes I just sat in the parking lot and watched the lights flicker. Everywhere I went, I saw you. A waitress with hair pulled into a tired bun. A middle-aged woman rubbing her hands together to push away the cold. A busboy wiping tables as if his life depended on someone's approval. I began to understand something I should have learned long ago. People do not walk the world carrying their resumes. They walk carrying their sacrifices. You carried yours alone, but you were not the only one. In a town in New Hampshire, I sat at a counter and ordered black coffee. The server, maybe 40, maybe 50, asked if I wanted cream. Her voice cracked the way yours used to after long shifts, not fragile worn. She saw the luggage at my feet and asked if I was traveling for business. I said no. Then she asked if I was traveling for family. I opened my mouth, but grief tightened my throat. She didn't press. She didn't pry. She simply refilled my cup. There are people like that everywhere. Women who do the quiet work of the world. They keep coffee hot, floors clean, backpacks on children, and hope somewhere inside them, even when hope has no evidence. I thought of how many of those women live and die unnamed, unthanked, unremembered. They don't get statues or awards. They don't write memoirs. They leave receipts in purses and children who mistake independence for abandonment. I drove on. When I finally returned to Boston, I did not go to my apartment first. I went to the office. It was late enough that the building was nearly empty. The security guard nodded at me as if I'd been gone only a weekend. My office smelled like paper and stale ambition. On my desk sat files, contracts, reminders of all the ways I had measured success numbers, signatures, deals, deadlines. None of it looked real anymore. I turned on the desk lamp and saw my reflection in the window, a man who had built a life without learning how to live. I opened my computer and pulled up photo sweatings, conferences, dinners at expensive restaurants. I searched for you in them. You weren't there. I searched my phone. Not a single picture of us together. Not one. It hit me like a punch. I had photographed sunsets, plates of food, faces of people I barely knew, but not the woman who raised me. What kind of son does that? A successful one, the world would say. A terrible one, the truth responded. I stopped going to work for a while. I claimed personal reasons, and no one questioned me. Grief is the one excuse society accepts without demanding receipts. I stayed in my apartment and let grief do its work. It peeled back years of arrogance, like wallpaper revealing rotting wood. It forced me to confront the boy I had been and the man I had become. I tried to cook chicken and dumplings again. This time I did not rush. I followed your handwriting, the small notes, the simple instructions. The steam fogged my glasses the way it had fogged yours. I stood in the kitchen and cried not because I failed, but because I succeeded. The dumplings held. They did not fall apart. I sat at the table and ate alone. For the first time in decades, I felt like your son. Months passed. Grief loosened its grip, but did not release me. It stayed in the quiet corners of my apartment, sitting beside me like a patient teacher. One afternoon, I opened a drawer and found the recipe card again, now creased from being folded so many times. Your words stared back at me. Save this for someone who needs it. I thought of the boy at the diner in Portland. I thought of the waitress refilling my coffee without asking questions. I thought of all the hands like your hands that never asked to be admired, only used. I realized something I should have known long ago. I could not rewrite your life, but I could honor it. Not with flowers or plaques or tears, but with action. I returned to Portland. The diner owner recognized me immediately. He didn't ask how I was doing. He simply nodded, the way men do when they understand pain without needing its details. I told him I wanted to pay off any debts left behind. He shook his head. She didn't leave debts. He said, she left kindness. Then he said something I will never forget. Your mother never took more than she needed, but she always gave more than she had. I couldn't respond. He handed me a small cardboard box. Her things, he said. Inside were 3 aprons, all worn thin, all washed carefully. A name tag, Marlin. Not Mom, not Mother, not Mrs. Harrington, just Marlene, the name the world knew. A set of keys to the diner locker she rarely used, a hair tie, and a small notebook filled with tiny lists. Groceries, rent, hours worked, hours switched with coworkers so they could rest, birthdays of waitresses' children, numbers of people who owed her money, and customers she worried about. Not once did she list herself. And on the last page, written small and crooked, if Michael visits, tell him he has nothing to repay. You died believing I owed you nothing. But love is not a debt, it is an inheritance. I carry it now, and it is heavier than all my successes combined. Dear Mom, I didn't leave Portland right away. The city felt like a wound I had ignored for decades. I walked through it the way a person walks through a childhood home after everyone is gone slowly, as if sudden movements might erase the past. I went to the places you used to go, the laundromat with coins scratched into silver dust, the grocery store with fluorescent lights that never sleep, the narrow sidewalk near Forest Avenue where the snowbanks always swallowed half the street. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had. Life moves forward without asking permission. Grief is the only thing stubborn enough to stay behind. I sat on a bench outside the laundromat, watching dryers spin in circles like time itself. A young mother struggled with 2 kids and a basket of clothes. She looked exhausted, the kind of exhaustion that hides beneath the eyes, not on the face. She was doing what you once did, what millions of women do every day. I almost offered to help, but I stopped. I didn't know how. Kindness is a language I never learned fluently. The next day, I visited the owner of the diner again. I asked if I could speak to the staff. He raised an eyebrow. "You going to give a speech?" he asked. "No," I said. "I want to listen." He told them why I was there, who I was, and they gathered cautiously, like people expecting bad news. A young waitress asked the first question. What was she like at home? I opened my mouth. I meant to answer, but every memory I had was shaped around absence yours or mine. I searched the room for a sentence that wouldn't break me. "She kept working," I finally said, "even when it hurt." The waitress nodded. "That sounds like her." Another woman, older, spoke quietly. She never took her breaks. I'd tell her to sit down and she'd just laugh. A cook leaned back against the refrigerator. "She gave me her winter coat once," he said. "I tried to give it back and she said she had another one at home. I remembered the boots by your door. You never had another coat." They talked for nearly 30 minutes about meals you paid for when someone was short, about double shifts you took so a coworker could go to her daughter's recital, about customers who treated you like wallpaper and never realized you were the reason the place stayed alive. They remembered everything I never asked about. I listened. I didn't interrupt. I didn't defend myself. Grief makes you humble, and shame teaches you when to stay silent. Before I left, the young waitress handed me something, a napkin. On it, 3 words, "Thank you, Marlene. You weren't just a worker. You were someone's lifeline." I drove to the cemetery that afternoon. The snow had melted into patches of brown grass, the earth wet and uneven. Your grave looked simple, no flowers, no marble, just a small, temporary marker waiting to be replaced. I knelt beside it. I didn't know what to say. Words feel useless when the listener is gone. So I sat. Not 10 minutes, not an hour, long enough for the cold to creep into my bones. I used to think time was something expensive, billable, measurable, worth bragging over. But sitting there, I understood something your hands had been trying to tell me all along. Time isn't precious because of what you do with it. It's precious because of who you spend it with. And I had spent almost none of mine with you. I didn't cry this time. I had cried every tear the week before, kind that empties the lungs. What remained was something quieter, heavier, like carrying a stone in the chest. Before I left, I whispered one thing. I'm here, not I'm sorry, not I love you, just I'm here. Because grief isn't an apology, it's presence, finally offered too late. Back in Oregon, life did not go back to normal. I didn't want it to. I began asking strangers questions I never asked you. How are you? Do you need help? Are you tired? Most of them were surprised. Some were suspicious. A few smiled as if someone had finally noticed they existed. I volunteered at a community kitchen. At first, I only handed out trays. Then I cooked. Then I listened to stories told by people who didn't speak until someone told them they mattered. I learned the names of women who worked double shifts and men who cared for sick parents and teenagers barely surviving. Their stories were not unique. Their pain was not glamorous. Their sacrifices were not cinematic. They were human. And that made them holy. One night, while closing up, a woman said something that struck me. You asked questions like someone who lost someone. I didn't deny it. I didn't explain. I simply nodded. You must have loved them a lot, she said. I almost replied with the truth. I didn't love her enough while she was here. But I didn't, because grief rewrites. Love it doesn't erase it. Instead, I said, yes, I did. I carried your letter with me everywhere. Not in a frame, not in a box folded in my wallet like a secret. Sometimes I read it at night, sometimes in parking lots. Once in a train station restroom when I couldn't stop shaking. You wrote, be kind to yourself. That was the one instruction I could not follow. I was good at punishing myself, good at remembering every failure, good at counting the ways I could have saved you, though none were possible. But kindness, that was a foreign language, one I was just beginning to learn. Then, one evening at the community kitchen, I saw a girl about 18 scraping food from plates into a bin. Her hands were red from hot water. She moved quickly, trying not to be seen. I recognized that posture, the posture of someone who believes the world won't catch them if they fall. I approached her gently. "Do you want to take a break?" I asked. She looked startled, then suspicious. "Why? Because you look tired." She blinked at me as if I'd said something obscene. No one had ever asked her that before. I could tell. She hesitated, then whispered, "Thank you." Her voice trembled. And I understood that I had just given her something you never asked from anyone but always deserved: permission to rest. Dear Mom. People think grief is loud screaming, breaking plates, collapsing into bed sheets. But grief isn't thunder. It's a slow leak. It drips into life the way water seeps through old pipes quietly, patiently, until one day the floor buckles and you realize everything underneath has rotted. For months after you died, I lived like that. Not broken, not healed somewhere in the middle, like a bridge no one trusts enough to cross. One evening, after volunteering at the kitchen, I drove home and found myself parked outside a food bank. I hadn't planned to be there. Grief drives like an old horse that remembers paths you never consciously choose. Inside, a few volunteers were sorting donated cans. A woman waved me over without asking who I was. The work was simple. Stack, rotate, organize. I could do it without thinking. A man next to me, maybe 70, put labels on boxes with shaky hands. He hummed under his breathin' old country melody, the kind of song that belongs to dusty roads and long winters. Something about it reminded me of the way you hummed when folding clothes, as if singing quietly could prevent the seams of the world from splitting open. He noticed me watching. "First time?" he asked. "Yes," I said. He nodded with a familiarity that did not require history. "Everybody's here for a reason," he said. "Some of us just don't know ours yet." I wanted to tell him about you, about the diner, about the boots by the door, about hands that never rested. Instead, I just whispered, "I'm trying." "That's enough," he replied. Not encouragement, not pity, a statement of fact. I believed him. A few weeks later, I went back to Boston for work. Life expects routines, even when the heart doesn't. In the office, people treated me normally: meetings, handshakes, the language of performance. Nobody knew how to speak to the bereaved. They praised accomplishments but ignored absence. It was easier to smile than to explain. So I put on the old mask, the one that fit so tightly it left no room to breathe. A colleague asked if I'd like to join him for drinks after work. I declined. He assumed I was tired. He didn't know that exhaustion is different from grief. Tiredness goes away with sleep. Grief wakes when you do. Later that night, I opened your letter again. Be kind to yourself. I tried to imagine you writing that, sitting at the kitchen table with the plain wooden chair, the overhead bulb casting shadows over your fingers. You probably wrote it on a night when you were sore, or after counting tips that would never stretch far enough. You were not a poetic woman. You never wrote things to sound beautiful. You wrote them because they were true. That sentence simple, small, felt heavier than any legal contract I had drafted in my life. I never asked you if you were kind to yourself. I never asked if anyone was. I don't know why it took losing you to understand that love is not something you give only when asked. It is something you pour even when the cup is empty. You had poured until your hands shook. I kept volunteering. One afternoon, the girl I had spoken to, the one washing dishes with red hands, was back. She looked different, not happier, not healed, just less invisible. She approached me awkwardly. "Can I ask you something?" I nodded. "You said I looked tired," she whispered. "No one ever notices stuff like that." "Why did you?" I should have said something wise. I should have spoken about empathy or compassion. Instead, I said the truth. Someone should have asked my mother that a long time ago. Her eyes widened, and not with pity, but recognition. "I get that," she murmured. We stood in silence. And for the first time in my life, silence wasn't a wound. It was a bridge. A few nights later, I found myself cooking again. Chicken and dumplings, not out of nostalgia, out of practice. You cook grief the way some people pray, repeatedly, imperfectly, because doing nothing hurts more. As the dumplings simmered, steam fogged my glasses. I laughed quietly. You would have said, "Wipe them or you'll burn the food." You always spoke in practical warnings, never poems. I plated the meal and thought about calling anyone to share it. But life is cruel in a gentle way. You don't learn how to love until the person who taught you has already gone. So I ate alone. One weekend I returned to the cemetery. I brought nothing. No flowers, no trinkets, no words rehearsed like speeches. I just sat on the damp earth and told you about my day, how I had learned the names of the cooks at the kitchen, how I had helped a woman carry boxes to her car, how I had donated a week's salary to the food bank without telling anyone. None of it felt like enough, but it was honest. A breeze moved through the trees cold, thin, indifferent. I pretended it was you, that you were saying what you always said when I made a mistake as a child. It's all right. Try again. I stayed until my knees ached. I wasn't waiting for a sign. I was waiting for memory to stop hurting. It didn't. But the pain felt cleaner, not like punishment, like something being carved away. On the drive home, I stopped at a rest area. An old man sat alone on a bench, coat zipped high, breathing clouds into the winter air. He looked at me the way you used to look at strangers, without fear, without judgment, as if every person was a secret story worth hearing. I sat beside him. We didn't speak. Two strangers, side by side, letting time pass. It wasn't healing, it wasn't therapy, it was simply human. And sometimes, Mom, that is enough. Dear Mom, there is a moment in grief when the memories stop shouting and start whispering. I didn't know when it happened. I only realized one morning that thinking of you no longer felt like being struck by lightning. It felt like holding a warm stone still, heavy, still unmovable, but no longer burning. I began talking to you in small ways, not out loud, not like prayer, just thoughts that slipped into the quiet. Look at that driver, he reminded me of the fisherman. You would hate this weather. I know you'd tell me to wear gloves. It startled me how natural it became, how your voice sat beside mine, softened by distance. There is something no one tells you about losing a parent. You don't just lose who they were. You lose the version of yourself that existed in their eyes. You knew me as a boy, a student, a young man with two big dreams. You knew versions of me I abandoned. You carried them even when I refused to. Now I am a man with losses, and no one alive remembers the smaller versions I outgrew too quickly, except you, and you are gone. One evening, I visited the community kitchen after hours to help with inventory. The building was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels like honest-to-know customers. No service, no performance. The girl from before, the 18-year-old, was wiping down tables. Her sleeves were rolled up, revealing thin wrists and bruised knuckles. She noticed me. You're back, she said. I shrugged. I'm usually here on Thursdays. She nodded like that confirmed something she'd been uncertain about. After a moment, she spoke again. My mom used to work like this, she said. Late nights, 2 jobs. I always told myself it was temporary. She swallowed hard. She died when I was 14. Heart failure. I didn't say I'm sorry. Those words are too small for wounds that reach bone. I just waited. She never said she was tired, she whispered, just kept going, like someone forgotten by the world. Her eyes shifted to mine, full of a familiar pain that had spent too long in silence. I wanted to lie, to say grief gets easier. But I had learned the truth. Grief does not shrink. You grow around it. She wasn't forgotten, I said quietly. She was a lighthouse. You just didn't know you were meant to steer by her. The girl blinked, unsure. That doesn't make it hurt less. No, I agreed. It only tells you why it hurts. She wiped her eyes with the back of her wrist and nodded. We didn't talk again that night. We didn't need to. Some conversations happened without words. I eventually returned to work full-time, but something in me no longer bent the way it used to. Colleagues noticed. You're different, one of them said. He meant it as a compliment, but I could see confusion in his eyes, like he had lost a map and wanted me to redraw it for him. Before, I moved through the world like someone trying to outrun a past. Now I move like someone carrying one. Not proudly, not beautifully, just honestly. A client once told me I seemed calm, as if I had found some secret that other people didn't know. I almost laughed. The secret was not serenity. It was loss. Loss makes you slow down. Loss makes you look. Loss makes you see the people you once stepped over. I didn't tell him that. He wouldn't have understood. Your birthday came, I bought a single candle, not a cake, just the candle. I didn't light it. It wasn't a ritual or a tradition. It was a reminder you once existed. I cooked your chicken and dumplings again. This time, I wasn't trying to impress anyone. I wasn't trying to replicate perfection. I just wanted to honor the act of making something warm. I sat at the table, placed the bowl in front of me, and whispered, "Happy birthday, Mom." I didn't expect a response. I didn't expect comfort. But something happened. Not an epiphany, not peace, just a quiet realization. Love doesn't evaporate when the body dies. It becomes geography. Every memory is a landmark. Every regret is a road. Every kindness is a bridge. I saw you everywhere, at the diner counter and the way a woman counted tips 3 times to make sure they'd last, in the bus driver's cracked knuckles, in the grocery bagger who carried food for an old man without being asked, people who worked until their bodies protested, people who hid their pain behind service, people who believed exhaustion was something you swallowed, not something you shared. You were one of them, and now I am one of the people who finally sees them. Months later, I made a decision that surprised everyone in my office. I resigned. There was no dramatic speech or explanation, just a letter, short and unadorned. Thank you. It's time for me to do something else. Coworkers thought I was burned out. Some thought I was reckless. One assumed I had inherited money. No one suspected grief. Grief is invisible unless you are wearing it like I was. I didn't know what I would do next. I only knew what I could not do anymore. Live a life that could not touch another. You didn't raise me to be successful, Mom. You raised me to survive. And survival means recognizing that purpose is not profit. I rented a small space in Bend and started a program for young people aging out of the foster system. They needed jobs, mentors, and someone who didn't treat them like statistical failures. I didn't know how to build a nonprofit. I didn't know how to fundraise. I barely knew how to ask for help. But I remembered your recipe card. Don't rush it. They fall apart if you rush them. So I didn't rush. I hired slowly. I listened often. I made mistakes and learned from them. I let the kids teach me how to see the world again. And every Friday, I cooked for them. Nothing fancy, just food that was warm. They didn't know who I used to be. They didn't know what I lost. They didn't know the name Marlene Harrington. They only knew a man who cared whether they ate. And that, somehow, felt like enough. Dear Mom, the first time one of the kids from the program called me Mr. H, I almost corrected him. I wanted to say I'm not a teacher, but the words stopped in my throat. I wasn't a lawyer anymore. I wasn't a son running from his childhood. I wasn't a man measuring his worth by invoices and numbers. I was someone who showed up. It amazed me how much showing up mattered. Not perfect advice, not miracles, just presence. They didn't need someone who solved every problem. They needed someone who didn't disappear when things got ugly. I knew that pain too well. You waited your whole life for someone not to leave. I never understood that until there was no one left to wait for. One afternoon, a boy named Eli stayed after the others had gone. 16 years old, shoulders too tense for his age, eyes permanently alert as if danger were a sound he could hear before everyone else. He hovered near the kitchen doorway where I was washing dishes. "Do you need help?" I asked. He shrugged. "Not really. Just don't want to go back to the house." "Bad day?" I asked. He shook his head. "Every day." He spoke like someone who only told the truth when he was tired enough not to care about consequences. I dried my hands and sat across from him. He didn't speak for a while. Silence grew between us like a slow tide. Eventually he looked at me and said, "You look like someone who used to be somebody." It wasn't an insult, it was a diagnosis. I took a breath. Then I answered honestly, "I used to think I was somebody. Now I'm trying to be someone better." He tilted his head, as if examining the difference. What changed? I didn't say grief or death or the word mother. I said, a pair of hands. He didn't understand, but he didn't forget. Weeks later, he would ask me again, and I would tell him. The program grew slowly, sometimes painfully. Kids broke rules. Some disappeared for weeks. Some cursed at me, spit on the floor, stormed out in anger because I asked them how they were doing. I didn't take it personally. Pain has its own vocabulary. There was one girl named Sophia who quit 3 times, Not formally, she just stopped coming. Each time she returned, she avoided eye contact, sat in the corner, and folded napkins with the precision of someone who doesn't trust their own emotions. Once, after she stormed out mid-meal, a volunteer said, "She's hopeless." I surprised myself. "No," I said, "she's protecting herself." It was the first time I said something you would have said. I didn't realize until the words left my mouth. At night, when the kids were gone and the building was quiet, I sometimes stayed alone. I'd sit at one of the tables, elbows on wood, head in my hands, like a child doing homework too late. I tried to picture your face, not the last version, frail, half awake, barely holding on. I tried to remember the woman who stood at the stove, who wiped her hands on an apron, who carried the weight of mornings before her first cup of coffee. Memory is cruel. It never preserves what we ask for. It only keeps what it wants. I could no longer recall the exact sound of your laugh. But I remembered how my chest felt when I made you laugh like sunlight after snow. I couldn't remember every word you ever said, but I remembered the ones you never spoke. "I'm tired. I'm lonely. I wish someone would help me." You carried them in silence. I inherited them by accident. One spring afternoon, I received a phone call from the diner owner. His voice was the same, gravel and fatigue. "We're closing," he said. I didn't understand. "What do you mean?" "Business is down. Rent is up. It's over." There was no sentiment in his tone, just resignation. "It'll be a bar, I think," he added, "or a vape shop." Who knows? The world devours places like that. Places built on routine, not profit. I drove to Maine the next day. The diner windows were covered in brown paper. The neon sign was unplugged. Even the faded, open-closed placard was gone, as if someone had erased the last piece of intention. I stood in the parking lot longer than I should have. It felt like standing beside a hospital bed long after the machines had been turned off. I didn't try to go inside. Some doors are sacred once they close. Instead, I walked around to the back entrance the one employees used. Rust along the hinges, a dent in the metal where someone once kicked it open. I placed my palm on it, the way a child presses a hand to a gravestone. I whispered, "Thank you." Not to a building, not to bricks, to you. You had kept that place alive long enough for strangers to feel at home. Even I had become one of them. I drove along the coast afterward. Wind hammered through the cracks in the window. The ocean roared without apology loud, ancient, unbothered. I watched waves tear themselves apart against the rocks, not graceful, not poetic, just honest. I thought about your life, how you moved through it without applause, without complaint, without rest. Some people die quietly. You died the way you lived without demanding attention. But the world you touched didn't forget. Not the fisherman, not the waitress, not the teenage boy with the apron, not the girl who needed someone to tell her she looked tired, not me, especially not me. On the drive back to Oregon, I kept the recipe card in the passenger seat. I kept your letter in my coat pocket. I kept grief beside me like a traveling partner. I used to think the lesson was forgiveness. Forgive myself. Forgive time. Forgive choices. But that wasn't it. The real lesson was simpler. See people when they are alive, not when they are gone. I had failed you, but I would not fail every stranger who carried your same quiet pain. That was the only apology the world would accept, and maybe the only one you would have wanted. Dear Mom, it has been more than a year since you died. People think grief fades like bruises dark at first, then quietly dissolving into skin until no one can see it. But grief is not an injury. It is architecture. It builds rooms inside you, some small and cramped, some large and solemn. You wander them like hallways, passing photographs no one else can see. I have filled those rooms with you, not as a shrine, not as punishment, but as a map of what I never understood when you were here. Recently, one of the boys in the program, Ellie, asked me a question that struck deeper than any sermon or therapy session ever could. We were sitting in the courtyard, the late evening sun catching dust in the air like small constellations. He had just finished washing dishes. He stretched out his arms, palms open, showing the small cuts in dried soap. "Does it ever stop hurting?" he asked. I could have given him a soft lie. I could have said yes, just to make him sleep better that night. But I remembered you, your boots by the door, your cracked hands over boiling water, your letter taped to the refrigerator. So I told him the truth. No, it doesn't stop hurting, but it stops punishing you. He stared at me, mouth slightly open, as if trying to reconcile those two ideas, pain and mercy, loss and endurance. I clarified. The hurt becomes a language. You stop drowning in it. You learn how to speak. He nodded slowly, like someone who had been living underwater and was tasting air for the first time. Sometimes I wonder what you would think of me now. Not the professional version, not the man in a suit, not the young attorney who wore ambition like armor, but the man who stands in a kitchen stirring soup for children who don't know where they'll sleep tomorrow. Would you laugh? Would you cry? Would you say you knew I would end up here? Or would you nod quietly the way you always did, as if life was never complicated, only difficult? I think you would say nothing. You would simply hand me a towel, wipe a counter, and get to work. One Friday evening, I was cleaning up after dinner when Sophia, the girl who quit 3 times, came to the kitchen door. Her eyes were red, but not from rage this time. There was something else there, something fragile. She held out a clear plastic bag filled with folded shirts. I washed the uniform, she said. That wasn't your job, I replied. I know. She was waiting for me to understand the rest without forcing her to say it. So I did. Thank you. She looked down at her hands, twisting the bag's handles. My mom used to do that for me, she whispered, when I was little, before everything went bad. The kitchen lights hummed softly above us, fluorescent and indifferent. Some people spend their whole lives waiting for softness. Others create it in spite of everything. You're doing it for yourself now, I said. She shook her head. No, I did it because I thought maybe you'd notice. That sentence cut deeper than any courtroom argument I'd ever made. You spent your whole life hoping someone would notice, and I was too busy believing that noticing wasn't a form of love. I answered the only way I knew how. I do notice. Her chin trembled. She nodded once, sharply, like a soldier acknowledging orders. Then she walked away. I watched her go, whispering a promise you would not hear. I will not ignore them the way I ignored you. At night, I still talk to you. Not every night, not in desperation. Just when the world turns quiet enough that your ghost can sit beside me without making a sound, sometimes I ask questions. Was it worth it? Were you scared when you collapsed? Did you know I would come? Were you angry at me? You never answer. But grief has given me the ability to translate silence. Your answers arrive slowly, without words. You gave because giving was the shape of your existence. You endured because no one else would have endured for us. You asked for nothing because asking required hope, and hope was something you spent on me. A few months ago, I returned to Portland again, not for the cemetery, not for the diner. I went to your old apartment building. The landlord had rented it to a young couple. They were carrying grocery bags up the stairs when I arrived, laughing about something trivial brand of cereal, parking space, spilled milk. The hallway still smelled like paint, but the door to your unit looked different. Fresh hinges, a new lock. I didn't knock. I didn't want the past to answer. I simply left 2 things outside the door, a small bouquet of daisies and a note that said, "May this home be gentle to you." I wrote it for them, but I also wrote it for you, for the years that apartment held your exhaustion, your quiet, your stubborn hope. When I returned to Oregon, I drove to the coast at sunrise. The ocean was calm, almost shy, as if unspeaking water could imitate your restraint. I stood barefoot on the sand, wind pressing salt against my skin. The horizon stretched endlessly, unhurried. I said your name, not mom, not mother, not the identity you embodied for everyone else, just your name, Marlene. The sea carried the sound away, not as a prayer, not as a request, but as an acknowledgement. For the first time in my life, I wasn't trying to bring you back. I was letting you move forward without me. I walked back to the car, shoes in hand, sand stuck to my feet. The world felt enormous, and for once, not hostile. There was no revelation, no epiphany, just a steady truth. I miss you, and I am finally someone who can bear that weight. Dear Mom, there comes a point when grief is no longer about the dead. It becomes about the living, what we choose to do with the ache that will never leave us. I didn't recognize that moment when it happened. It arrived the way spring sneaks into the north. Slow, wet, muddy, almost embarrassing in how subtle it is. One afternoon, I sat with the kids at the program while they ate lunch. I didn't talk, I just listened. A boy with hair dyed electric blue was explaining how he'd gotten a job at a car wash. He bragged about tips like they were trophies. Another boy teased him. A girl rolled her eyes. Someone asked if the food was microwaved. Someone else said their foster father hated when they came home late. None of it was special. There was no cinematic shift in the air. Just kids eating, talking, complaining, laughing. And somewhere in the middle of their noise, I realized I was no longer alone. Not because they loved me, not because they understood me, but because I finally understood them. Not everyone gets a family, Mom. Some of us have to build one grain by grain. Like salt on the rim of a glass, you built one for me with your hands long before I knew what family meant. Now I am building one for strangers, and I don't even know their birthdays. But this time, I show up. This time, I stay. One day, while cleaning the pantry shelves, I found Sophia sitting on the floor behind a stack of boxes. Her head rested on her arms, knees pulled up to her chest. I sat down beside her. We didn't speak at first. Finally, she whispered, "I don't know how to do this." "What?" I asked. "Living." She didn't look at me, just stared at the tiles as if they could explain a universe she'd never been taught. In another life. The life before you died. I would have tried to fix it, to reason with her, to offer some cheap optimism about resilience or opportunities. Instead, I said the only honest thing I could. "I don't either. Not really. I'm learning." She let out a tired laugh. "You're old." "I'm not that old." "You're old," she insisted. "You should know more than I do." I leaned my head against the wall. I used to think life was about climbing stairs. School, job, career, respect, then you die. And now? Now I think the stairs were a lie. It's just a kitchen table. And people sit with you when they can. She nodded slowly. People sit with me for a little while, she said. Then they leave. I thought of you, standing in a diner at Bonn muy lam am, pouring coffee for strangers who would never remember your name. "No," I said gently. "They leave because they don't know how to stay. You didn't do anything wrong." Her eyes filled with tears, not dramatic, not loud, just the human kind that stained cheeks quietly. I didn't hug her. I didn't give a speech. I just stayed there on the tile floor, two people breathing in the same tired air. Sometimes presence is the only language pain understands. Weeks later, Eli approached me again. He wasn't angry this time. He held something in his hand, a folded sheet of notebook paper. He didn't offer it. He just kept turning it over with his fingers, like he was afraid it might disappear. "I've been writing letters," he said. "To who?" I asked. He shrugged. "Nobody. Just letters." We were sitting outside on the steps. The sun was low. The air smelled like grilled food drifting from a nearby patio. "What do you write?" I asked. "Stuff I don't know how to say." "To who?" I repeated. Another shrug. "Someone. Anyone. Maybe just me." He paused. "You ever write letters to people who can't read them anymore?" I exhaled slowly. "Yes," I said, "I do." He nodded like that confirmed something important. I thought it was dumb. "It's not dumb," I replied. "It's how you learn to talk to yourself." He looked confused. "Letters are to other people." "No," I said. "Letters are what you wish you had said when there was still time. So you practice on paper." He stared at me for a moment, then slipped the folded page into his pocket. "Maybe one day I'll let someone read one." "When you're ready," I said. He shook his head. "No, when it stops hurting." I didn't correct him. Everyone gets to learn the hard truths in their own time. The first anniversary of your death came quietly. I didn't buy flowers. I didn't go to Maine. I didn't kneel by the grave like a penitent. I simply went home after work and set a pot of water to boil. I made chicken and dumplings, not the dish itself, the ritual, the flour on my fingers, the dough pressed flat. The dumplings pinched, shaped, dropped gently into the broth. Steam fogged my glasses. I didn't wipe it. I didn't curse. I didn't rush. The dumplings held. They didn't fall apart. I placed the bowl on the table. No prayer, no speech, just the truth. You mattered, even if I didn't understand it while you were alive. I set a second bowl across from mine. Not because I believed you could eat, not because I expected ghosts, but because I finally understood something. love has to sit at the table. If it stands at the door forever, waiting to be invited, it starves. I carried your letter to bed that night. I didn't read it. I didn't need to. I already know every word by heart. Be kind to yourself. I am trying, Mom. Not because I deserve it, but because you did. And I will not waste the wisdom you bled into the world. Dear Mom, I spent most of my life believing that closure was an event, a moment. A door slamming shut, something loud, decisive, cinematic. But closure is not a thunderclap, it is a breath. It arrives when you are washing dishes, or walking home under a tired moon, or waiting for a pot of water to boil. It comes when your mind is quiet enough that memory is no longer a weapon. For me, it arrived in the kitchen of the program on an unremarkable Tuesday. We had just finished serving dinner. The kids were wiping tables, scraping plates, arguing about music. Someone cursed, someone laughed, someone begged for more bread. It felt like any other evening. I was cleaning the stove, bent slightly forward, one hand pressed to the counter for balance. And then, very suddenly, I realized I was not thinking about you in fragments, not the hospital bed, not the diner, not the boots, not the letter. I was thinking about you as a whole person, not as grief, not as guilt, not as a wound, just a woman living her life the best way she could, a woman who worked, who endured, who laughed sometimes, who dreamed, even if she never said the dreams aloud. You weren't a symbol, you weren't a lesson, you weren't a ghost trailing after me through the world. You were simply my mother. The moment was so ordinary I almost missed it. I finished cleaning. I washed my hands. I hung the towel on its hook. But something inside me had softened. The anger at myself, the endless, grinding regret didn't vanish. It simply lost its teeth. For the first time, I didn't feel like I was trying to apologize to the past. I felt like I was living in the present you would have wanted for me. And that, I think, is closure. I still visit Maine from time to time. Sometimes I stand in the cemetery with both hands in my coat pockets, kicking at the cold, muttering mundane updates like, "We hired a new counselor," or "The pantry needs more volunteers," or "Sophia made brownies and nobody pretended not to like them this time. I don't kneel anymore. I don't bring flowers. I don't show up like an orphan. I speak like a son, one who is no longer begging the earth to undo itself." A few weeks ago, I received a letter from Eli. He still writes. He still folds his pages the way someone folds a secret. He wrote, "I'm not angry all the time anymore. I don't know if that means I'm getting better or just tired, but I'm trying. I hope that counts. It does count. Trying always counts." I kept his letter next to yours. In the same drawer, 2 generations of pain learning how to speak out loud. I wonder if someday he will write to someone he lost. Not because loss makes us wise, but because it teaches us where we break and where we bend. There's a girl who recently joined the program. She barely talks. She hates eye contact and flinches when someone calls her name too loudly. Last week, she sat alone at the edge of the dining room while everyone else ate. Her plate went untouched. I asked if she was hungry. She shook her head without looking up. I didn't insist. I didn't crowd her with concern. I just sat down next to her with my own bowl of soup. Eventually, she whispered, barely audible, "I don't know how to be here." And what surprised me most was how easily the words came out of my mouth. I didn't either. It gets easier. No speeches, no instructions, just presence. You taught me that without ever saying it aloud. You cooked dinner. You worked sunrise shifts. You carried silence like a lantern. Your love was never a performance. It was a practice. Now it's my turn. I don't know if I've become a good man. I don't know if the world will remember me or the kids I try to help. Maybe we will all disappear into the noise, the way most people do. But here is what I know. Love is not the memory of what we didn't say. Love is what we choose to do after we finally understand. I cannot repay you. I cannot rewrite the past. I cannot fix the years I spent running from the very person who kept me alive. But I can cook meals for people who are hungry. I can sit with the tired. I can notice hands that tremble. I can ask strangers whether they are okay. I can stay in rooms that other people leave. And every time I do, I feel a small truth bloom in my chest. You are still here. Not in photographs, not in graves. but in the way I choose to live. So this is my last letter, Mom. Not because I am done missing you. I will never be done. Not because I have healed. Grief does not end. It just finds a better chair to sit in. I am ending this letter because I finally understand something you knew long before I did. Life is not measured in grand gestures or perfect endings. It is measured in hands that keep working, eyes that notice, chairs we pull out for others, and meals we make without anyone asking. That was your legacy, and it is mine now. I will carry it forward, quietly, patiently, one stranger, one bowl, one tired heart at a time. Thank you, Mom, for everything you said and for everything you never did. Love, Michael. Thank you for being here with us today. Some stories don't ask for applause. They don't ask for lessons or advice or judgments. They simply ask us to sit still and listen. Michael reminded us of something many of us forget. Love is not always loud. Sometimes it whispers in the routine, in the hands that cook, in the shifts worked after midnight, in the lives carried quietly for our sake. If you saw a piece of your own mother in this story, or a sister, or a friend, you're not alone. On Kitchen Table Talks, we don't try to fix the past, we honor it. We give it a seat at the table so no one has to carry their memories alone. If this story touched you, tell us in the comments. Not because we need your words, but because someone else out there might need to read them. Subscribe if you'd like to join us for more conversations like this. And tonight, when you sit down to eat, even if it's just for 5 quiet minutes, think about the hands that fed you, even when they were tired. We'll see you next time.